This is part 2 of Eustace Mullins's The Secrets of the Federal Reserve book. And we are on chapter 2. And there was something I wanted to say. Oh, yeah, I wanted to say, well, first, let's just get the disclaimer out of the way. This is for educational purposes only. This is for the purposes of criticism, perhaps, although Mr. Mullins has definitely done a lot more research than I have. It's definitely for comment, possibly news reporting, although this is not really news. This book has been out for well over 60 years in one form or another, as in the introduction and the foreword and other about the author maybe even had said so. What's the actual copyright of this iteration? The one that I hold in my hand is copyrighted in 1991, but this has been out since 1952. This is for teaching, perhaps, but I'm no teacher. Perhaps Mr. Mullins can teach someone that perhaps is listening. It possibly scholarship, although I'm not a scholar, and certainly for research, whether it's my own research or if it happens to benefit others. I would highly suggest getting the book for yourself, and if you're really into some heavy research. So I give no medical, legal, or any other type of binding advice in this video or on my channel. So please take that as duly noted. So with that out of the way, the other thing I wanted to say before we get going here is that all these backgrounds that I have for my videos are pictures from my own collection. These are my pictures, my photos. I don't use AI for the production of these videos. It's just me with my microphone and StreamYard, basically, and the books. That's pretty much it. So that being said, let's get into the text. Chapter 2, the Aldrich Plan. And if I sound tired or maybe a little winded, it's because I am a little tired, so hopefully I can get through this without messing up this recording. I walk about 4 miles a day, which is not much, and I do exercises. I don't know. I'm just a little tired, I suppose, a little more than usual. Anyway, quote, finance and the tariff are reserved by Nelson Aldrich as falling within his sole purview and jurisdiction. Mr. Aldrich is endeavoring to devise through the National Monetary Commission a banking and currency law. A great many 100,000 persons are firmly of the opinion that Mr. Aldrich sums up in his personality the greatest and most sinister menace to the popular welfare of the United States. Ernest Newman recently said, quote, what the South visits on the Negro in a political way. This is the words of Ernest Newman, so let's not get this, don't get your brain all twisted. Um, he says what the South visits on the Negro in a political way, Aldrich would mete out to the mudsills of the North if he could devise a safe and practical way to accomplish it. End quote. End quote. Harper's Weekly, May 7th, 1910. Holy cows. One heck of a quote. And this was around the same time where they had that secret meeting in at Jekyll Island. It's about 5 months before that fated meeting that these shadowy figures had in or on Jekyll Island. Anyways, the participants in the Jekyll Island conference returned to New York to direct a nationwide propaganda campaign in favor of the quote Aldrich Plan, end quote. 3 of the leading universities, Princeton, Harvard, and the University of Chicago, that's the what school is that? The economics. Is that von Mises connected to von Mises? Anyway, that's neither here nor there. This Chicago school, at least Chicago is connected to that, I think, if I remember right. Anyway, Princeton, Harvard, and the University of Chicago were used as the rallying points for this propaganda, and national banks had to contribute to a fund of $5 million to persuade the American public that this central bank plan should be enacted into law by Congress. Woodrow Wilson, governor of New Jersey and former president of Princeton University, was enlisted as a spokesman for the Aldrich Plan. During the Panic of 1907, Wilson had declared, quote, all this trouble could be averted if we appointed a committee of 6 or 7 public-spirited men like J.P. Morgan to handle the affairs of our country, end quote. Wow, what a puppet. Holy cows. Let's give the criminals a committee to do more criminal things. Yay, how about that? Such a good plan. Moving on. In his biography of Nelson Aldrich in 1930, Stevenson says, quote, a pamphlet was issued January 16th, 1911, quote, suggested plan for monetary legislation, end quote, by Honorary Nelson Aldrich, based on Jekyll Island conclusions, end quote. Stevenson says on page 388, quote, an organization for financial progress had been formed. Mr. Warburg introduced a resolution authorizing the establishment of the Citizens' League, later the National Citizens League. Professor Laughlin, the Laughlin, I think that's Laughlin, of the University of Chicago was given charge of the League's propaganda, end quote. End quote, I think. There's like quotes within quotes, so bear with me. It is notable that Stevenson characterizes the work of National Citizens League as propaganda, quote unquote, in line with Seligman's exposition of Warburg's work as, quote, the education of the country, end quote, and, quote, to break down prejudices, end quote. Much of the $5 million of the bankers' slush fund was spent under the auspices of the National Citizens League, which was made up of college professors. The 2 most tireless propagandists for the Aldrich Plan was Professor O. M. Sprague, Sprague, of Harvard, and J. Lawrence Laughlin of the University of Chicago. which is the same guy as before. Yeah, Professor Laughlin in the quote. Yeah, it's the same guy. Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. notes, quote, J. Lawrence Laughlin, chairman of the executive committee of the National Citizens League since its organization, has returned to his position as professor of political economics in the University of Chicago in June 1911. Professor Laughlin was given a year's leave from the university that he might give all his time to the campaign of education undertaken, excuse me, by the League. He has worked indefatigably, 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 fatigatively. I'm just stumbling over these words. Permit me some grace, please. And it is largely due to his efforts and his persistence that the campaign enters the final stage with flattering prospects of a successful outcome. The reader knows that the University of Chicago is an institution endowed by John D. Rockefeller with nearly $50 million. End quote. Well, isn't that interesting? Nearly $50 million. In his biography of Nelson Aldrich, Stevenson reveals that the Citizens League was also a Jekyll Island product. In chapter 24, we find that, quote, no quote, the Aldrich plan was represented, chapter 24 of what? This book? I don't think there's 24 chapters in this book. No, there's only 14. I'm not sure which book he's referring to, unless it's maybe Lindbergh's book that he just quoted. Because the footnote says Charles A. Lindbergh Sr., Banking, Currency, and the Monetary Trust, 1913, page 131. Oh wait, let's read the rest of the sentence. I didn't even do it because there's a star. In chapter 24, we find that the Aldrich Plan was represented to Congress as the result of 3 years of work, study, and travel by members of the National Monetary Commission, with expenditures of more than $300,000. There's this asterisk in 1911. Here's the footnote. In 1911, the Aldrich Plan became part of the official platform of the Republican Party. So I'm assuming this is chapter 24 is from Lindbergh's publication. Testifying before the Committee on Rules, December 15th, 1911, after the Aldrich Plan had been introduced in Congress, Congressman Lindbergh stated, quote, our financial system is a false one and a huge burden on the people. I have alleged that there is a money trust. The Aldrich Plan is a scheme plainly in the interest of the trust. Why does the money trust press so hard for the Aldrich Plan now, before the people know what the money trust has been doing? End quote. Lindbergh continues in a speech, quote, the Aldrich Plan is the Wall Street Plan. It is a broad challenge to the government by the champion of the money trust. It seems another panic, if necessary, to intimidate it means another panic, if necessary, to intimidate the people. Aldrich, paid by the government to represent the people, proposes a plan for the trusts instead. It was by a very clever move that the National Monetary Commission was created. In 1907, nature responded most beautifully and gave this country the most bountiful crop it had ever had. Other industries were busy too, and from a natural standpoint, all the conditions were right for a most prosperous year. Instead, a panic entailed enormous losses upon us. Wall Street knew the American people were demanding a remedy against the recurrence of such a ridiculous, unnatural condition. Most senators and representatives fell into the Wall Street trap and passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Emergency Currency Bill. But the real purpose was to get a monetary commission which would frame a proposition for amendments to our currency and banking laws, which would suit the money trust. The interests are now busy everywhere educating the people in favor of the Aldrich Plan. It is reported that a large sum of money has been raised for this purpose. Wall Street speculation brought on the panic of 1907. The depositors' funds were loaned to gamblers and anybody the money trust wanted to favor. Nothing has changed. Then, when the depositors wanted their money, the banks did not have it. That made the panic. End quote. Well, it seems like Mr. Lindbergh here knows what's going on. Edward Vreeland, co-author of the bill, wrote in the August 25th. It says in the August 25th, 1910. Independent. I guess Independent is a publication that has a date from there, which was owned by Aldrich, so it's a newspaper, I guess, or something. Quote, under the proposed monetary plan of Senator Aldrich, monopolies will disappear because they will not be able to make more than 4% interest, and monopolies cannot continue at such a low rate. Also, this will mark the disappearance of the government from the banking business. End quote. Yeah, what a load of shit that is. Freeland's fantastic claims were typical of the propaganda flood unleashed to pass the Aldrich Plan. Monopolies would disappear, the government would disappear from the banking business. Pie in the sky, yeah, that's for sure. Nation magazine, January 19th, 1911, noted, quote, the name of central bank is carefully avoided, but the quote Federal Reserve Association, end quote, the name given to the proposed central organization, is endowed with the usual powers and responsibilities of a European central bank, end quote. After the National Monetary Commission had returned from Europe, it held no official meetings for nearly 2 years. No records or minutes were ever presented showing who had authored the Aldrich Plan. No transparency, no accountability. Well, you know what that means. Since they held no official meetings, the members of the commission could hardly claim to the plan as their own. See, no accountability. The sole tangible result of the commission's $300,000 expenditure was a library of 30 massive volumes on European banking. Typical of these works is a 1,000-page history of the Reichsbank, Reichsbank, Reichsbank. CH is like a hard C, I think. I'm not too familiar with German. Anyways, the central bank which controlled money and credit in Germany. And what was that? I heard a noise. Never mind, getting distracted. Anyway, Reichsbank. The central bank which controlled money and credit in Germany and whose principal stockholders were the Rothschilds. Sad trombone. Sad trombone. And Paul Warburg's family banking house of M.N. Warburg Company. The Commission's records show that it never functioned as a deliberative body. Indeed, its only meeting, quote unquote, was the secret conference held at Jekyll Island. And this conference is not mentioned in any publication of the Commission. Senator Cummins, Cummins, passed a resolution in Congress ordering the Commission to report on January 8th, 1912, and show some constructive result of its 3 years' work. That should be a hoot. In the face of this challenge, the National Monetary Commission ceased to exist. Oh, man. Wow, bunch of cowards. With their $5 million as a war chest, the Aldrich Plan propagandists waged no holds barred war against their opposition. Andrew Frame testified before the House Banking and Currency Committee in 1913 as a member of the Executive Committee of the American Bankers Association. He represented a group of Western bankers who opposed the Aldrich Plan. Well, well, well. Maybe there are some good bankers. We'll have to see. Chairman Carter Glass. What a name. Quote, why didn't the Western bankers make themselves heard when the American Bankers Association gave its unqualified and, we are assured, unanimous approval of the scheme proposed by the National Monetary Commission? That was Chairman Carter Glass speaking. End quote. Andrew Frame, quote, I'm glad you called my attention to that. When that monetary bill was given to the country, it was but a few days previous to the meeting of the American Bankers Association in New Orleans in 1911. There was not one banker in 100 who had read that bill. Nothing has changed in basically 100 years. Nothing. What is going on? We had 12 addresses in favor of it. General Hamby of Austin, Texas, wrote a letter to President Watts asking for a hearing against the bill. He did not get a very courteous answer. I refused to vote on it, and a great many other bankers did likewise. Well, that's something, I suppose. End quote. Mr. Buckley, quote, do you mean that no member of the association could be heard in opposition to the bill? End quote. Andrew Frame, quote, they throttled all argument, end quote. Mr. Kindred, quote, but the report was given out that it was practically unanimous, end quote. Andrew Frame, quote, the bill had already been prepared by Senator Aldrich and presented to the Executive Council of the American Bankers Association in May 1911. As a member of that council, I received a copy the day before they acted on it. Only one day, and you're supposed to review something in one day. How big was it? I mean, I'm sure it was bigger than it would take like a month or something to review it. They do this shit all the time, run through things through the fucking system before anybody can fucking even like make heads or tails of it. God, that reminds me of Pelosi saying, let's vote the bill in to see what it says. God, I just had, it's like the hugest facepalm ever. Maybe not ever, that's superlative. I hate superlatives. Anyway, back to Andrew Frame saying, when the bill came in at New Orleans, the bankers of the United States had not read it, end quote. Mr. Kindred, quote, did the presiding officer simply rule out those who wanted to discuss it negatively? End quote. Andrew Frame, quote, they would not allow anyone on the program who was not in favor of the bill, end quote. Dirty tricks. Same old shit. Chairman Glass, quote, what significance has the fact that at the next annual meeting of the American Bankers Association held at Detroit in 1912, the association did not reiterate its endorsement of the plan of the National Monetary Commission known as the Aldrich Scheme, end quote. Andrew Frame. It quote, it did not reiterate the endorsement for the simple fact that the backers of the Aldrich Plan knew that the association would not endorse it. We were ready for them, but they did not bring it up, end quote. Andrew Frame exposed the collusion which in 1911 procured an endorsement of the Aldrich Plan from the American Bankers Association, but which in 1912 did not even dare to repeat its endorsement for fear of an honest and open discussion of the merits of the plan. Yeah, sleazy. Chairman Glass then called as witness one of the 10 most powerful bankers in the United States, George Blumenthal, partner of the international banking house of Lazard Freres, Lazard space Freres, and brother-in-law of Eugene Mayer Jr., Carter Glass effusively welcomed Blumenthal, stating that, quote, Senator O'Gorman of New York welcomed Blumenthal enough to suggest your name to us, end quote. A year later, O'Gorman prevented a Senate committee from asking his master, Paul Warburg, any embarrassing questions before approving his nomination as the first governor of the Federal Reserve Board. Jesus. George Blumenthal stated, quote, since 1893, my firm of Lazard Freres has been foremost in importations and exportations of gold, and there has thereby come into contact with everybody who had anything to do with it, end quote. Congressman Taylor asked, quote, have you a statement there as to the part you have had in the importation of gold into the United States, end quote. Taylor asked this because the Panic of 1893 is known to economists, as a classic example of a money panic caused by gold movements. So that's a pretty poignant question, right? Quote, no, replied George Blumenthal. I have nothing at all on that because it is not bearing on the question, end quote. Sheesh. A banker from Philadelphia, Leslie Shaw, dissented with other witnesses at these hearings, criticizing the much vaunted, quote, decentralization, end quote, of the system. He said, quote, under the Aldrich Plan, the bankers are to have local associations and district associations, and when you have a local organization, the centered control is assured. Suppose we have a local association in Indianapolis. Can you not name the 3 men who will dominate that association? And then can you not name the 1 man who will dominate the 3? The same is true in Richmond and everywhere else. When you have hooked the banks together, they can have the biggest influence on anything in this country, with the exception of the newspapers, end quote. And they can buy it. Did he say earlier in maybe the last chapter about buying up? No, I might be thinking of. Yeah, I'm thinking of a different book about them buying up the newspapers. So, anyways, to promote the democratic currency bill, Carter Glass made public the sorry record of the Republican efforts of Senator Aldrich's. And my headset turns off. My headset is fully charged, so I don't know what the deal with that is. Anyways, Carter Glass made public the sorry record of the Republican efforts of Senator Aldrich's National Monetary Commission. His House report in 1913 said, quote, Senator McVeigh, M-A-C, capital V-E-A-G-H, fixes the cost of the National Monetary Commission to May 12th, 1911 at $207,130. They have since spent another $100,000 of the taxpayers' money. The work done at such cost cannot be ignored, but having examined the extensive literature published by the Commission, the Banking and Currency Committee finds little that bears upon the present state of the credit market of the United States. Excuse me. We object to the Aldrich Bill on the following points. Excuse me. Its entire lack of adequate government and public control of the banking mechanism it sets up, its tendency to throw voting control into the hands of the large banks of the system. There you go. The extreme danger of inflation of currency inherent in the system. That's a key point there. We're feeling that right now, right? Fucking inflation. The insincerity of the bond funding plan provided for by the measure, there being a barefaced pretense that this system was to cost the government nothing. It's a big pretense. The dangerous monopolistic aspects of the bill. Our committee, at the outset of its work, was met by a well-defined sentiment in favor of a central bank, which was the manifest outgrowth of the work that had been done by the National Monetary Commission. End quote. Glass's denunciation of the Aldrich Bill as a central bank plan ignored the fact that his own Federal Reserve Act would fulfill all the functions of a central bank. Sheesh. Its stock would be owned by private stockholders who could use the credit of the government for their own profit. It would have no control of the nation's money and credit resources, and it would be a bank of issue which would finance the government by mobilizing quote unquote credit in time of war. Well, there's a clue right there. In the rationale of central banking, quote unquote, Vera C. Smith, Committee for Monetary Research and Education, June 1981, writes, quote, the primary definition of a central bank is a banking system in which a single bank has either a complete or residuary monopoly on the note issue. A central bank is not a natural product of banking development. It is imposed from outside or comes into being as the result of government favors. End quote. I mean, that's pretty straightforward. Thus, a central bank attains its commanding position from its government granted monopoly on the note issue. Issuing notes, banknotes, that is. This is the key to its power. Also, the act of establishing a central bank has a direct inflationary impact because of the fractional reserve system, which allows the creation of book entry loans and thereby money a number of times the actual money, quote unquote, which the bank has in its deposits or reserves. The Aldrich Plan never came to a vote in Congress because the Republicans lost control of the House in 1910 and subsequently lost the Senate and the presidency in 1912. Hmm. Chapter 3, the Federal Reserve Act. Uh, yeah, this is a kind of long one. But we're good on time, right? I think so. That's the name of the chapter 3, the Federal Reserve Act. Quote, our financial system is a false one, and a huge burden on the people. This act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth, end quote. Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh Sr. The speeches of Senator LaFollette, or LaFollette, L-A, capital F, Ollette, another French name, and Congressman Lindbergh became rallying points of opposition to the Aldrich Plan in 1912. They also aroused popular feeling against the money trust. Congressman Lindbergh said on December 15th, 1911, quote, the government prosecutes other trusts, but supports the money trust. I have been waiting patiently for several years for an opportunity to expose the false money standard, excuse me, and to show that the greatest of all favoritism is that extended by the government to the money trust, end quote. I like this guy. He seems like he's got his heads like he has more than one head. His head on his shoulders. Senator LaFollette publicly charged that a money trust of 50 men controlled the United States. Holy cows. Oh, conspiracy. George F. Baker, partner of J.P. Morgan, on being queried by reporters as to the truth of the charge, replied that it was absolutely in error. Of course he's going to say that. He's paid to say that. He said that he knew from personal knowledge that not more than 8 men ran this country. Oh boy, no, it's not 50 men. Are you kidding me? It's only 8 of us. Sad trombone. The Nation magazine replied editorially to Senator LaFollette that quote, if there is a money trust, it will not be practical to establish it that it exercises its influence either for good or for bad, end quote. Well, that's milquetoast. Senator LaFollette remarks in his memoirs that his speech against the monetary trust later cost him the presidency of the United States. Sad trombone. Just as Woodrow Wilson's early support of the Aldrich Plan had brought him into consideration for that office. Well, there you go. There's part of the control, right? Congress, at least back 100 years ago, over 100 years ago, Congress finally made a gesture to appease popular feeling by appointing a committee to investigate the control of money and credit in the United States. This was the Pujo Committee, Pujo, Pujo or Puyo, probably Pujo, maybe, a subcommittee of the House Banking and Currency Committee, which conducted the famous money trust, quote unquote, hearings of in 1912. Under the leadership of Congressman Arsene Pujo of Louisiana, ArsenePujo of Louisiana, who was regarded as a spokesman for oil interests. Sheesh. These hearings were deliberately dragged on for 5 months and resulted in 6,000 pages of printed testimony in 4 volumes. Now that's a report. Holy crap. Not like these dumb reports these days that cover up things, right? Unless this is a cover up too. 6,000 pages though, that's a lot. Month after month, the bankers made the train trip from New York to Washington, testified before the committee, and returned to New York. The hearings were extremely dull, and no startling information turned up at these sessions. Oh, that's a bummer, but not surprising either. So I guess the 6,000 pages was a big nothing burger like the rest of them. Warren Commission rings a bell. I lost my place. Where was I? Extremely dull. Yeah, the bankers solemnly admitted that they were indeed bankers. Slick. Insisted that they always operated in the public interest. Yeah, my ass they did. And claimed they were animated only by the highest of ideals of public service. How dare you question our morality? How dare you question how dare you question us? Yeah, fuck you. Like the congressman before whom they were testifying. Like, we're doing public service like you guys. Yeah, bunch of horse shit. The paradoxical nature of the Puyo money trust hearings may better be understood if we examine the man who single-handedly carried on these hearings, Samuel Untermeyer, Untermyer. He was one of the principal contributors to Woodrow Wilson's presidential campaign fund. Well, there you go. And was one of the wealthiest corporation lawyers in New York. He states in his autobiography, in Who's Who of 1926, that he once received a $775,000 fee for a single legal action, the successful merger of the Utah Copper Company and the Boston Consolidated and Nevada Company, a firm with a market value of $100 million. He refused to ask either Senator LaFollette or Congressman Lindbergh to testify in the investigation which they alone had forced Congress to hold. Sheesh. As special counsel for the Puyo Committee, Untermeyer ran the hearings as a one-man operation. The congressional members, including its chairman, Congressman Arsene Pujo, I don't know, seem to have been struck dumb from the commencement of the hearings to their conclusion. One of these silent servants of the public was Congressman James Burns of South Carolina, representing Bernard Baruch's home district, who later achieved fame as Baruch's man, quote unquote, and was placed by Baruch in charge of the Office of War Mobilization during the Second World War. It's all connected, right? Although he was a specialist in such matters, Untermeyer did not ask any of the bankers about the system of interlocking directorates through which they controlled industry. He did not go into international gold movements, which were known as a factor in money panics or the international relationships between American bankers and European bankers, the international banking houses of Eugene Mayer, Lazard Ferrers, J. and W. Seligman, Ladenburg Thalmann, uh, Speyer brothers, M. Warburg, and the Rothschild brothers did not arouse Samuel Untermeyer's curiosity, although it was well known in the New York financial world that all of these family banking houses either had branches or controlled subsidiary houses in Wall Street. When Jacob Schiff, yeah, that piece of shit, if I remember correctly, when Jacob Schiff appeared before the Peugeot committee, Mr. Untermeyer's adroit questioning allowed Mr. Schiff to talk for many minutes without revealing any information about the operations of the banking house of Kuhn Loeb Company, of which he was senior partner, and which Senator Robert L. Owen had identified as the representative of the European Rothschilds in the United States. The aging J.P. Morgan, who had only a few more months to live, appeared before the committee to justify his decades of international financial deals. He stated for Mr. Untermeyer's edification that, quote, money is a commodity, end quote, quote unquote. Money is a commodity. That tells you something. This was a favorite ploy of the money creators, as they wished to make the public believe that the creation of money was a natural occurrence akin to the growing of a field of corn, although it was actually a bounty conferred upon the bankers by governments over which they had gained control. J.P. Morgan also told the Peugeot committee that, in making a loan, he seriously considered only one factor: a man's character. Even the man's ability to repay the loan or his collateral were of little importance. This astonishing observation startled even the blasé members of the committee. The farce of the Peugeot committee ended without a single well-known opponent of the money creators being allowed to appear or testify. Figures. As far as Samuel Untermeyer was concerned, Senator La Follette and Congressman Charles Augustus Lindbergh had never existed. Nevertheless, these congressmen had managed to convince the people of the United States that the New York bankers did have a monopoly on the nation's money and credit. At the close of the hearings, the bankers and their subsidized newspapers claimed that the only way to break this monopoly was to enact the banking and currency legislation now being proposed to Congress. You motherfuckers. A bill which would be passed a year later as the Federal Reserve Act. The press seriously demanded that the New York banking monopoly be broken by turning over the administration of the new banking system to the most knowledgeable banker of them all, Paul Warburg. The presidential campaign of 1912 records one of the more interesting political upsets in American history. The incumbent, William Howard Taft, was a popular president, and the Republicans, in a period of general prosperity, were firmly in control of the government through a Republican majority in both houses. The Democratic challenger, Woodrow Wilson, governor of New Jersey, had no national recognition and was a stiff, austere man who excited little public support. Both parties included a monetary reform bill in their platforms. The Republicans were committed to the Aldrich Plan, which had been denounced as a Wall Street plan, and the Democrats had the Federal Reserve Act. Neither party bothered to inform the public that the bills were almost identical, except for the names. See, this is this is why this is exactly one of the reasons why the left right dialectic is just that. It's a dialectic. It's just to keep us separated and arguing at each other while they laugh all the way to the bank. Figuratively and I guess literally. Um, we're almost identical except for the names. In retrospect, it seems obvious that the money creators decided to dump Taft and go with Wilson. How do we know this? Taft seemed certain of re-election, and Wilson would return to obscurity. Suddenly, Theodore Roosevelt, quote, threw his hat into the ring, end quote. He announced that he was running as a third-party candidate, the Bull Moose, quote unquote. His candidacy would have been ludicrous had it not been for the fact that he was exceptionally well financed. Well, isn't that something? Moreover, he was given unlimited press coverage. There's another tell. More than Taft and Wilson combined. Nothing has changed at all. As a Republican ex-president, it was obvious that Roosevelt would cut deeply into Taft's vote. This proved the case, and Wilson won the election. To this day, no one can say what Theodore Roosevelt's program was, or why he would sabotage his own party. Wow, no one could even say what it was? That's just ridiculous. But it's not surprising because that shit's happened even today. I mean, you have Ross Perot in '92 running as a third party candidate and against with George Clinton for the Democrats and Bob Dole for the Republicans. And Bob Dole obviously lost and Clinton won. Ross Perot didn't really. Ross Perot just basically sucked. I believe, if I remember right, he sucked votes from the Republican Party, and that's how Dole lost the election. Anyways, since the bankers were financing all three candidates, see, financing all three of them, it doesn't matter who you vote for. It certainly didn't. I would say it mattered more then, but now it seems even less likely that. Anyways, since the bankers were financing all three candidates, they would win regardless of the outcome. See, when you have a lot of money, you can do stuff like that. Later congressional testimony showed that in the firm of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Felix Warburg was supporting Taft. Paul Warburg and Jacob Schiff were supporting Wilson, and Otto Kahn was supporting Roosevelt. The result was that a Democratic Congress and a Democratic president were elected in 1912 to get the central bank legislation passed. It seemed probable that the identification of the Aldrich Plan as a Wall Street operation predicted that it would have a difficult passage through Congress, as the Democrats would solidly oppose it, whereas a successful Democratic candidate supported by a Democratic Congress would be able to pass the central bank plan. Taft was thrown overboard because the bankers doubted he could deliver on the Aldrich Plan, and Roosevelt was the instrument of his demise. There's like a little tiny font here, like an additional, like someone typed into the book afterwards with a little star. So like a footnote, but it's right after the paragraph and not at the end of the page. Star. The final electoral vote in 1912 was Wilson 409, Roosevelt 167, and Taft 15. So, man, he got trounced. 15? That's it? That's ridiculous. That's the electoral vote, mind you, not the popular vote, but still. Dude was like smashed. Totally smashed. And he thought he was assured of re-election in the earlier paragraph. Yeah, Taft seemed certain of re-election and Wilson would return to obscurity, is the sentence I'm looking for. He seemed certain of the election, but he got demolished. That's ridiculous. To further confuse the American people and blind them to the real purpose of the proposed Federal Reserve Act, the architects of the Aldrich Plan, powerful Nelson Aldrich, although no longer a senator, and Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank, set up a hue and cry against the bill. They gave interviews whenever they could find to an audience denouncing the proposed Federal Reserve Act as inimical to banking and to good government. The bugaloo of inflation was raised because of the Act's provisions for printing Federal Reserve notes. The Nation, on October 23rd, 1913, pointed out, quote, Mr. Aldrich himself raised a hue and cry over the issue of government fiat money, quote unquote. Womp womp. Sad trombone. That is, money issued without gold or bullion back of it. Although a bill that to do precisely that has been passed in 1908, Rubro, with his own name as author, and he knew besides that the government, quote unquote, had nothing to do with it, that the Federal Reserve Board would have full charge of the issuing of such monies, end quote. Frank Vanderlip's claims were so bizarre that Senator Robert L. Owen, chairman of the newly formed Senate Banking and Currency Committee, which had been formed on March 18, 1913, accused him of openly carrying on a campaign of misrepresentation about the bill. The interests of the public, so Carter Glass claimed in a speech on September 10th, 1913, to Congress, would be protected by an advisory council of bankers. Quote, there can be nothing sinister about its transactions. Meeting with it at least 4 times a year will be a bankers' advisory council representing every regional reserve district in the system. How could we have exercised greater caution in safeguarding the public interests? End quote. Glass claimed that the proposed Federal Advisory Council would force the Federal Reserve Board of Governors to act in the best interest of the people. Senator Root, R-O-O-T, it's a very interesting name. Senator Root raised the problem of inflation, claiming that under the Federal Reserve Act, note circulation, basically banknotes circulate. Note circulation would also expand indefinitely, causing great inflation, hyperinflation, perhaps. However, the latter history of the Federal Reserve System showed that it not only caused inflation, but that the issue of notes could also be restricted, causing deflation, as occurred in 1929, occurred from 1929 to 1939. Well. One of the critics of the proposed decentralized quote-unquote system was a lawyer from Cleveland, Ohio, Alfred Crozier, 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 Crozier was called to testify for the Senate committee because he had written a provocative book in 1912, U.S. Money versus Corporate Currency. And there's a little asterisk. We got a little footnote here. Crozier's book exposed the financiers' plan to substitute. And my headset conked out again. This is very lovely. All right, this footnote says Crozier's book exposed the financiers' plan to substitute corporation currency, quote unquote, for the lawful money of the U.S. as guaranteed by Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 5 of the Constitution. Back to the regular text. He attacked the Aldrich-Vreeland Act of 1908 as a Wall Street instrument, and he pointed out that when, our government had to issue money based on privately owned securities, we were no longer a free nation. Yeah, I'll say. Quote, Crozier testified before the Senate committee that, quote, it should prohibit the granting or calling in of loans for the purpose of influencing quotation prices of securities and the contracting of loans or increasing interest rates in concert by the banks to influence public opinion or the action of any legislative body. Within recent months, William McAdoo, MC capital ADOO, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, was reported in the open press as charging specifically that there was a conspiracy among certain of the large banking interests to put a contraction upon the currency and to raise interest rates for the sake of making the public force Congress into passing currency legislation desired by those interests. Sheesh. The so-called administration currency bill grants just what Wall Street and the big banks for 25 years have been striving for. That is, and this is in quotes, private instead of public control of currency. End of all caps. It does this as completely as the Aldrich Bill. Both measures rob the government and the people of all effective control over the public's money and invest in the banks exclusively the dangerous power to make money among the people scarce or plenty. The Aldrich Bill puts this power in one central bank. The Administration Bill puts it in 12 regional central banks, all owned exclusively by the identical private interests that would have owned and operated the Aldrich Bank. President Garfield, shortly before his assassination, pause, YouTube. I'm reading Mullins's book. President Garfield, shortly before his undoing, we should say, declared that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of all the people. Well, isn't that something to say just before you get deleted? Whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of all the people. Thomas Jefferson warned us 100 years ago, as of 100 years ago. It would be more than 100 years ago, even at that time, wouldn't it? In this quote, Thomas Jefferson warned us 100 years ago that a private central bank issuing the public currency was a greater menace to the liberties of the people than a standing army. The pen is mightier than the sword. Who knew? I just want to underline this. Nothing is new under the sun, and as it would seem, end quote. With my commentary in there, I mean, obviously, but that's the end of the quote of this huge paragraph of a quote. It is interesting to note how many deletions of presidents of the United States follow their concern with the issuing of public currency. Lincoln with his greenback, non-interest bearing notes, and Garfield making a pronouncement on currency problems just before he was deleted. We now begin to understand why such a lengthy campaign of planned deception was necessary, from the secret conference at Jekyll Island to the identical reform quote-unquote plans proposed by Democratic and Republican parties under different names. Sheesh. The bankers could not wrest control of the issuance of money from the citizens of the United States, to whom it had been designated through its Congress by the Constitution, until the Congress granted them their monopoly for a central bank. Therefore, much of the influence exerted to get the Federal Reserve Act passed was done behind the scenes, principally by two shadowy, non-elected persons, the German immigrant Paul Warburg and Colonel Edward Mendel House of Texas. Paul Warburg made an appearance before the House Banking and Currency Committee in 1913, in which he briefly stated his background, quote, "I am a member of the banking house of Kuhn Loeb Company. I came over to this country in 1902, having been born and educated in the banking business in Hamburg, Germany, and studied banking in London and in Paris, and have gone all around the world. In the panic of 1907, the first suggestion I made was, quote, let us get a national clearinghouse, end quote. The Aldrich plan contains some things which are simply fundamental rules of banking. You aim in this plan, the Oswald Glass Bill, must you aim in this plan, the Owen Glass Bill must be the same: centralizing of reserves, mobilizing commercial credit, and getting an elastic note issue, end quote. Warburg's phrase, quote, mobilization of credit, end quote, was an important one, because the First World War was due to begin shortly, and the first task of the Federal Reserve System would be to finance the World War. The European nations were already bankrupt because they had maintained large standing armies for almost 50 years, a situation created by their own central banks, and therefore they could not finance a war. A central bank always imposes a tremendous burden on the nation for, quote, rearmament, end quote, and defense, quote unquote, in order to create inextinguishable debt, spontaneously creating a military dictatorship and enslaving the people to pay the interest, quote unquote, on the debt which the bankers have artificially created. Nothing has changed. The Senate debate on the Federal Reserve Act, in the Senate debate on the Federal Reserve Act, Senator Stone said on December 12th, 1913, quote, the great banks for years have sought to have and control agents in the Treasury to serve their purposes. Let me quote from this World article. Quote, just as soon as Mr. McAdoo came to Washington, a woman whom the National City Bank had installed in the Treasury Department to get advance information on the condition of banks and other matters of interest to the big Wall Street group, was removed. Immediately, the secretary and the assistant secretary, John Skelton Williams, were criticized severely by the agents of the Wall Street Group, end quote. End quote. Quote, I myself have known more than one occasion when bankers refused credit to men who opposed their political views and purposes. When Senator Aldrich and others were going around the country exploiting this scheme, the big banks of New York and Chicago were engaged in raising a munificent fund to bolster up the Aldrich propaganda. I have been told by bankers of my own state that contributions to this exploitation fund had been demanded of them, and that they had contributed because they were afraid of being blacklisted or boycotted. I'll make you an offer you can't refuse. There are bankers of this country who are enemies of the public welfare. In the past, a great few banks have followed policies and projects that have paralyzed the industrial energies of the country to perpetuate their tremendous power over the financial and business industries of America. End quote. Carter Glass states in his autobiography that he was summoned by Woodrow Wilson to the White House and that Wilson told him he intended to make the reserve notes obligations of the United States. Glass says, quote, I was for an instant speechless. I remonstrated. There is not any government obligation here, Mr. President. Wilson said he had to compromise on this point in order to save the bill. End quote. The term compromise, quote unquote, on this point came directly from Paul Warburg. Colonel Elisha Eli Garrison in Roosevelt, uh, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law wrote, there's asterisk after Roosevelt, and it's Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin D. Roosevelt. So I guess the clarification in the name of this title, Roosevelt, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law wrote, quote, in 1911, Lawrence Abbey, Mr. Roosevelt's private office at, quote, the Outlook, end quote, handed me a copy of the so-called Aldrich Plan for currency reform. I said I could not believe that Mr. Warburg was the author. This plan is nothing more than the Aldrich-Vreeland legislation, which provided for currency issue against securities. Warburg knows that as well as I do. Warburg knows that as well as I do. I'm going to see him at once and ask him about it. All right, good luck. All right, good luck. Laughed Roosevelt. I went to Warburg and demanded to know the truth. Yes, I wrote it, he said. Why? I asked. It was a compromise, answered Warburg. End quote. Garrison says that Warburg wrote him on February 8th, 1912, quote, I have no doubt that at the end of a thorough discussion, either you will see it my way or I will see it yours, but I hope you will see it mine, end quote. This was another famous Warburg saying when he secretly lobbied congressmen to support his interest, the veiled threat that they should see it his way, quote unquote. Those who did not found large sums contributed to their opponents at the next elections, and usually went down in defeat. Colonel Garrison, an agent of Brown Brothers bankers, later Brown Brothers Harriman, had uh, had entree everywhere. Entree. entry everywhere in the financial community. He writes of Colonel House, quote, Colonel House agreed entirely with the early writing of Mr. Warburg, end quote. Page 333, he quotes Colonel House, quote, I am also suggesting that the Central Board be increased from 4 members to 5 and their term lengthened from 8 to 10 years. This would give stability and would take away the power of a president to change the personnel of the board during a single term of office. End quote. House's phrase, quote, take away the power of a president, end quote, is significant because later presidents found themselves helpless to change the direction of the government because they did not have the power to change the composition of the Federal Reserve Board to attain a majority on it during the president's term of office. Garrison also wrote in this book, quote, Paul Warburg is the man who got the Federal Reserve Act together, and after the Aldrich Plan aroused such nationwide resentment and opposition, the mastermind of both plans was Baron Alfred Rothschild of London. Wah, wah, wah. End quote. Obviously, sad trombone's not part of the quote. Colonel Edward Mendel House, and there's a little footnote, see House in biographies, quote unquote, was referred to Rabbi Stephen Weiss, or Wise, W-I-S-E, in his autobiography, Challenging Years. Yeah, challenging, all right. As, quote, the unofficial Secretary of State. So House was the unofficial Secretary of State, according to this Rabbi Stephen Wise. House noted that there's an end quote, I guess, the unofficial Secretary of State, quote unquote. House noted that he and Wilson knew that in passing the Federal Reserve Act, they had created an instrument more powerful than the Supreme Court. The Federal Reserve Board of Governors actually comprised a Supreme Court of Finance, and there was no appeal from any of their rulings. In 1911, prior to Wilson's taking office as president, House had returned to his home in Texas and completed his book called Philip Drew, Administrator. Drew as it's spelled D-R-E-U, comma, Administrator. Ostensibly a novel, it was actually a detailed plan for the future government of the United States, quote, which would establish socialism as dreamed by Karl Marx, end quote, quote unquote. According to House, this quote, which would establish socialism as dreamed by Karl Marx, according to House. This novel, quote unquote, predicted the enactment of the graduated income tax, excess profits tax, unemployment insurance, social security, and a flexible currency system. In short, it was the blueprint, which was later followed by Woodrow Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt administrations. The Wilson and Franklin D. Roosevelt administrations. It was published anonymously, quote unquote, by B.W. Huebsch, Huebsch of New York, and widely circulated among government officials, who were left in no doubt as to its author. Yeah, they all knew. There's 2 asterisks, so footnote C, Viereck. There's a little bit of a ink spot or something here, but V-I-E-R-E-C-K, Viereck or Viereck, note in biographies, quote unquote, who knew House for years, later wrote an account of the Wilson-House relationship. The friendship in History, the name of it. Footnote: George Sylvester Viereck, The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, Live Right, New York, 1932. In 1955, Westbrook Pegler, what a name, Pegler, the Hearst columnist from 1932 to 1956, heard of the Philip Drew book, and called Viereck to ask him if he had a copy. Viereck sent Pegler his copy of the book, and Pegler wrote a column about it, stating, quote, "One of the institutions outlined in Philip Drew is the Federal Reserve System. The Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns, the Rockefellers, the Morgans put their faith in House. The Schiff, Warburg, Rockefeller, and Morgan interests were personally represented in the mysterious conference at Jekyll Island. Frankfurter landed on the Harvard Law faculty thanks to a financial contribution to Harvard by Felix Warburg and Paul Warburg." And so we got Alger and Donald Hiss, Lee Pressman, Harry Dexter White, and many other proteges of Little Weenie. End quote. Footnote. Little Weenie is in all caps. So it's like a nickname for someone. Maybe the footnote will explain it. Footnote: the present writer was with Viereck in his suite at the Hotel Belleclaire when Pegler called and asked for the book. Viereck sent it over by a secretary. He grinned and said Pegler seemed very excited. Quote, "He ought to get a good column out of that," end quote, Viereck told me. Indeed, Pegler did get a good column out of it. Unfortunately for him, he had gone too far in mentioning the Warburgs. As long as he confined his attacks to La Grande Bouche, Bouche, parentheses, Eleanor Roosevelt, and her spouse, he had been permitted to continue. But now that he had exposed the Warburg connection with the committee spy ring in Washington, his column was immediately dropped by the big city dailies, and Pegler's long run was over. Well, isn't that something? End of footnote. House's openly socialistic views were forthrightly expressed in Philip Drew, Administrator. On pages 57 to 58, House wrote, quote, "In direct and forceful manner, he pointed out that our civilization was fundamentally wrong, inasmuch, among other things, as it restricted efficiency, ruh-roh, that if society were properly organized, there would be none who were not sufficiently clothed and fed. The result that the laws, habits, and ethical training in vogue were alike responsible for the inequalities in opportunity and the consequent wide difference between the few and the many, that the results of such conditions was to render inefficient a large part of the population, the percentage differing in each country in the ratio that education and enlightenment and unselfish laws bore to ignorance, bigotry, and selfish loss." End quote. Where are these inequalities of opportunity? No. Sad trombone. Equality of outcomes instead of like equality of merit. That's definitely socialistic. End quote. In his book, House Drew, in parentheses, envisions himself becoming a dictator and forcing on the people his radical views, page 148, quote, "They recognized the fact that Drew dominated the situation and that a mastermind had at least risen in the Republic," end quote. Now he assumes the title of general. Quote, "General Drew announced his purpose of assuming the powers of a dictator. They were assured that he was free from any personal ambition. He proclaimed himself, quote, administrator of the Republic," end quote, end quote. Footnote. It's just citing the book, so I mean that's. Oh wait, that's not the footnote. That's an I missed this. Never mind. The footnote says this quotation, Philip Drew, administrator, written by Colonel House in 1912, is included here to show his totalitarian Marxist philosophy. He was to become for 8 years with House was to become for 8 years with Wilson the president's closest advisor. Later, he continued his influence in the Franklin D. Roosevelt administration. From his home in Magnolia, Massachusetts, House advised FDR through frequent trips of Felix Frankfurter to the White House. Frankfurter was later appointed to the Supreme Court by FDR. Sheesh. Anyway, end of footnote. This pensive dreamer, who imagined himself a dictator, actually managed to place himself in the position of the confidential advisor to the President of the United States, and then to have many of his desires enacted into law. On page 227, he lists some of the laws he wishes to enact as dictator. Among them are an old age pension law, laborers insurance compensation, cooperative markets, a Federal Reserve banking system, cooperative loans, national employment bureaus, and other, quote, social legislation, end quote, some of which was enacted during Wilson's administration and others during Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration. The latter was actually a continuation of the Wilson administration, with many of the same personnel, and with House guiding the administration from behind the scenes. Like most of the behind the scenes operators in this book, Colonel Edward Mendell House had the obligatory, quote, London connection, end quote. Originally a Dutch family, Huis, quote unquote, Huis, Hus or Hois or something. I'm butchering this word. Apologies. His ancestors had lived in England for 300 years, after which his father settled in Texas, where he made a fortune in blockade running during the Civil War, shipping cotton and other contraband to his British connections, including the Rothschilds, and bringing back supplies for the beleaguered Texans. The senior House, not trusting the volatile Texas situation, prudently deposited all his profits from his blockade running in gold with Baring Banking House in London. Footnote. Dope Incorporated identifies Barings as follows, quote, Baring Brothers, the premier merchant bank of the opium trade from 1783 to the present day, also maintains close contact with the Boston families. The group's leading banker became, at the close of the 19th century, the House of Morgan. which also took its cut in the Eastern opium traffic. Morgan's Far Eastern operations were the officially conducted British opium traffic. Morgan's case deserves special scrutiny from American police and regulatory agencies for the intimate associations of Morgan Guarantee Trust with the identified leadership of the British dope bankers. End quote. End of footnote. Um, where am I? What? Where's the footnote? Oh, there it is. At the close of the Civil War, he was one of the wealthiest men in Texas. He named his son Mendel, quote unquote, after one of his merchant associates. According to Arthur Howden Smith, when House's father died in 1880, his estate and that's another headset turn off. I'm sorry. When House's father died in 1880, his estate was distributed among his sons as follows. Thomas Williams got the banking business, John the sugar plantation, and Edward M. the cotton plantations, which brought him an income of $20,000 a year. Citation Arthur Howard Smith, The Real Colonel House, Dorn Company, New York, 1918. Is the name of the book, The Real Colonel House. At the age of 12, the young Edward Mendel House had brain fever and was later further crippled by sunstroke. What the hell is even that? Do I have that? Oh, this might be a little bit too loud. Let's turn it down. What the hell is even that? Oh, why did it lag? What the hell is even that? Yeah, what the hell is even that? He was semi-invalid, and his ailments gave him an odd Oriental appearance. Sheesh. He never entered any profession, but used his father's money to become the kingmaker of Texas politics, successfully electing 5 governors from 1983 to 1911. Did I say 1983? I mean 1893, excuse me. In 1911, he begun to support Wilson for president, and through the crucial Texas delegation to him, which ensured his nomination. House met Wilson for the first time at the Hotel Gotham, May 31st, 1912. In The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House by George Sylvester Viereck. Excuse me. Viereck writes, quote, "What?" I asked House. "Cemented your friendship," end quote. Quote, "The identity of our temperaments and our public policies," end quote, answered House. Quote, "What was your purpose and his?" End quote. Quote, "To translate into legislation certain liberal and progressive ideas," end quote. End quote. House told Viereck that when he went to Wilson at the White House, he handed him $35,000. This exceeded only by the $50,000 which Bernard Baruch had given Wilson. Sheesh. The successful enactment of House's programs did not escape the notice of other Wilson associates. In Volume 1, page 157 of the intimate papers of Colonel House, House notes, quote, "Cabinet members like Mr. Lane and Mr. Bryan commented upon the influence of Drew with the president. Quote, all that the book has said should be," end quote, wrote Lane, quote, "comes about. Should be comes about. The president comes to Philip Drew, quote unquote, in the end," end quote. End quote, I think. Anyways, And there's the citation, blah, blah, blah. House recorded some of his efforts on behalf of the Federal Reserve Act in the intimate papers of Colonel House. Oh, it's the same book. Quote, December 19th, 1912, I talked with Paul Warburg over the phone concerning currency reform. I told of my trip to Washington and what I had done there to get it in working order. I told him that the Senate and the congressmen seemed anxious to do what he desired, and that President-elect Wilson thought straight concerning the issue, end quote. Thus we have Warburg's agent in Washington, Colonel House, assuring him that the Senate and Congressmen will do what he desires and that the President-elect, quote, thought straight concerning the issue, end quote. In this context, representative government seems to have ceased to exist. House continues in his papers, quote unquote, quote, March 13th, 1913, Warburg and I had intimate discussion concerning currency reform. March 27th, 1913, Mr. J.P. Morgan, Jr. and Mr. Denny of his firm came promptly at 5. McAdoo, I'm sure I'm saying that name wrong, McAdoo came about 10 minutes afterward. Morgan had a currency plan already printed. I suggested he have typewritten. I suggested that I suggested he have it typewritten so it would not seem too prearranged, and send it to Wilson and myself today. July 23rd, 1913. I tried to show Mayor Quincy of Boston to the folly of Eastern bankers taking an antagonistic attitude towards the currency bill. I explained to Major Henry Higginson, footnote, the most prominent banker in Boston, this Major Henry Higginson, with what care the bill and had been framed. Just before he arrived, I had finished a review by Professor Sprague of Harvard of Paul Warburg's criticism of the Glass-Owen bill, and will transmit it to Washington tomorrow. Every banker known to Warburg who knows the subject practically has been called up about the making of the bill. October 13th, 1913. Paul Warburg was my first caller today. He came to discuss the currency measure. There are many features of the Owen Glass bill that he does not approve. I promised to put him in touch with with McAdoo and Senator Owen so that he might discuss it with them. November 17th, 1913, Paul Warburg telephoned about his trip to Washington. Later, he and Mr. Jacob Schiff came over for a few minutes. Warburg did most of the talking. He had a new suggestion in regard to grouping the regular reserve banks so as to get the units welded together and in easier touch with the Federal Reserve Board, end quote. George Sylvester, this is still a quote, I think. George Sylvester Viereck, in The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel Mendel House wrote, quote, the Schiffs, the Warburgs, the Kahns, the Rockefellers, the Morgans put their faith in House. When the Federal Reserve legislation at last assumed definite shape, House was the intermediary between the White House and the financiers, end quote. On page 45, Viereck wrote, quote, Colonel House looks upon the reform of the monetary system as the crowning internal achievement of the Wilson administration, end quote. The Glass Bill, the House version of the final Federal Reserve Act, had passed the House on September 18th, 1913 by 287 to 85. Sheesh. On December 19th, 1913, the Senate passed their version by a vote of 54 to 34. More than 40 important differences in the House and Senate versions remain to be settled, and the opponents of the bill in both houses of Congress were led to believe that many weeks would yet elapse before the conference bill, would be ready for consideration. The congressmen prepared to leave Washington for the annual Christmas recess, assured that the conference bill would not be brought up until the following year. Now the money creators prepared and executed the most brilliant stroke of their plan. In a single day, they ironed out all 40 of the disputed passages in the bill and quickly brought it to a vote. On Monday, December 22nd, 1913, the bill was passed by the House 282 to 60 and the Senate 43 to 23. On December 21st, the day before, the New York Times commented editorially on the act, quote, New York will be a firmer basis of financial growth, and we shall soon see her the money center of the world, unquote. The New York Times reported on the front page Monday, December 22nd, 1913 in headlines, this is all caps, money bill may be law today. Conferees had adjusted nearly all differences at 1:30 this morning. No deposit guarantees. Senate yields on this point but puts through many other changes. Uh, End of all caps. Quote, with almost unprecedented speed, the conference to adjust the House and Senate differences on the currency bill practically completed its labors early this morning. On Saturday, the conference did little more than dispose of the preliminaries, leaving 40 essential differences to be thrashed out Sunday. No other legislation of importance will be taken up in either house of Congress this week. Members of both houses are already preparing to leave Washington. End quote. Jeez, they freaking rush it in. And they just jam it in there. It's so typical. Nothing has changed. Same kind of tactics. Unprecedented speed, quote unquote, says the New York Times. One sees the fine hand of Paul Warburg in this final strategy. Some of the bill's most vocal critics had already left Washington. It was a long-standing political courtesy that important legislation would not be acted upon during the week before Christmas. But this tradition was rudely shattered in order to perpetuate the Federal Reserve Act on the American people. Excuse me, like hiccups. They just ramshot it in there. Figures. The Times buried a brief quote from Congressman Lindbergh that, quote, the bill would establish the most gigantic trust on earth, end quote, and quoted Representative Guernsey, Guerncy, of Maine, Guernsey of Maine, a Republican on the House Banking and Currency Committee, that, quote, this is an inflation bill. The only question being the extent of the inflation, end quote. Sorry if I'm a little too loud, but this is crazy stuff. Congressman Lindbergh said on that historic day to the House, quote, this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government, hint, hint, by the monetary power will be legalized. The invisible government. Hello. Continuing. The people may not know it immediately, but the day of reckoning is only a few years removed. The trusts will soon realize that they have gone too far, even for their own good. The people must make a declaration of independence to relieve themselves from the monetary power. Wow, that's a shame. Never happens. It did it, and look where we are now. We're screwed, at least to some extent. Uh, Back to Lindbergh. This they will be able to do by taking control of Congress. Wall Streeters could not cheat us if you senators and representatives did not make a humbug of Congress. Yeah, spineless spineless motherfuckers. If we had a people's Congress, there would be stability. The greatest crime of Congress is its currency system. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetuated by this banking bill. The caucus and the party bosses have again operated and prevented the people from getting the benefit of their own government. End quote. I'm really liking this Lindbergh guy. He seems like he's really on point. I mean, I'm sure he's had his, his own skeletons in his closet, but I'm sure, but he seems a heck of a lot better than these spineless motherfuckers today. But they were spineless back then, or else we wouldn't be in this position, right? In the December 23rd, 1913 New York Times editorially commented, in contrast to Congressman Lindbergh's criticism of the bill, quote, the banking and currency bill became better and sounder every time it was sent from one end of the Capitol to the other. The Congress worked under public supervision in making the bill. What a sack of horse shit that is. Wow. I mean, obviously, when you got controlled media, the controlled newspapers, it's going to say bullshit like this. Quote, or by public supervision, quote unquote, the Times apparently meant Paul Warburg, one person who for several days had maintained a small office in the Capitol building where he directed the successful pre-Christmas campaign to pass the bill, and where senators and congressmen came hourly at his bidding to carry out his strategy. Well, now you see part of the invisible government at work, right? Did I read the unprecedented speed, quote unquote, with which the Federal Reserve Act had been passed by Congress during what became known as the quote the Christmas Massacre. Uh, Pause. YouTube. Um, and this is a quote. The Christmas Mass, or other, end quote, had one unforeseen aspect. Woodrow Wilson was taken unaware, as he, like many others, had been assured the bill would not come up for a vote until after Christmas. Now he refused to sign it, because he objected to the provisions for the selection of Class B directors. William L. White relates in his biography of Bernard Baruch that Baruch, a principal contributor to Wilson's campaign fund, was stunned when he was informed that Wilson refused to sign the bill. Well, at least he had a spine for like a microsecond. He hurried to the White House and assured Wilson that this was a minor matter which could be fixed up later, though, quote, administrative process, through administrative process, quote unquote. The important thing was to get the Federal Reserve Act signed into law at once. With this assurance, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act on December 23rd, 1913. Yeah, thanks a lot, Wilson. History proved on that day the Constitution ceased to be the governing covenant of the American people, and our liberties were handed over to a small group of international bankers. I mean, you can't get more straightforward than that, right? Right? People see this, right? I sure hope so. The December 24th, 1913 New York Times carried a front page headline, quote, Wilson signs the currency bill, end quote. That's in all caps, because, newspapers are going to have it in all caps to sell newspapers. Below it, also in capital letters, were two further headlines, quote, prosperity to be free, end quote, and quote, will help every class, end quote unquote. What a bunch of fucking horseshit. This is what propaganda gets you. Who could object to any law which provided benefits to everyone? Right, right. We're all getting help, right? As you're getting shafted by the very thing you're supposedly getting help from. Yeah, that's how it works. Uh, the Times described the festive atmosphere while Wilson's family and government officials watched him sign the bill. Barf. Quote, the Christmas spirit pervaded the gathering, quote unquote, exulted the Times. Makes you want to puke. In his biography of Carter Glass, uh, Rixey, Rixey, Rixey Smith states that those present at the signing of the bill included Vice President Marshall, Secretary Bryan, Carter Glass, Senator Owen, Secretary McAdoo, Speaker Champ Clark, and other Treasury officials. Um, None of the real writers of the bill, the draftees of Jekyll Island, were present. Yeah, figures. Excuse me. They had prudently absented themselves from the scene of their victory. Rixey Smith also wrote, quote, it was as though Christmas had come 2 days early, end quote. On December 24th, 1913, Jacob Schiff wrote to Colonel House, quote, my dear Colonel House, I want to say a word to you for the silent but no doubt effective work you have done in the interest of currency legislation, and to congratulate you to the measure that thus, THAS, this is a typo, probably thus, uh, congratulate you that the measure thus finally been enacted into law. I am I am with good wishes, faithfully yours, Jacob Schiff. End quote. Representative Moore of Kansas, in commenting on the passage of the act, said to the House of Representatives, quote, the President of the United States now becomes the absolute dictator of all the finances of the country. He appoints a controlling board of 7 men, all of whom belong to his political party, even though it is a minority. The Secretary of the Treasury is to rule supreme whenever there is a difference of opinion between himself and the Federal Reserve Board, and only, and in all caps, and only one member of the board is to pass out of office while the president is in office. End quote. The 10-year terms of office of the members of the board were lengthened by the Banking Act of 1935 to 14 years. Sheesh. Which meant that these directors of the nation's finances, although not elected by the people, held office longer than 3 presidents. While Colonel House, Jacob Schiff, and Paul Warburg uh, basked in the glow of a job well done, the other actors in this drama were subject to later afterthoughts. Woodrow Wilson wrote in 1916, National Economy and the Banking System. Uh, um, Senator something, it's SEN periods. I'm not sure what the abbreviation of that is. Send document number 3, comma, number 223, 76th Congress, one session, 1939, quote, our system of credit is concentrated in the Federal Reserve, 1939. Turn the page. In the Federal Reserve System, the growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. Well, that's pretty milquetoast of you, sir. Too little, too late. You had the chance and you done goofed. You done fucked up. But you had to be persuaded by your little uh, cronies, or not your cronies, the cronies of basically the Rothschilds, to convince you to sign the thing. Well, too little, too late. When he was asked by Clarence W. Barron whether he approved of the bill as it was finally passed, Warburg remarked, quote, well, it hasn't got quite everything we want, but the lack can be adjusted later by administrative processes. Right. End quote. Yeah. Give the devil an inch, and what does he do? He takes a mile. Two steps forward, one step back. You know the deal. It's, and we're still paying for it today, actually, and in perpetuity if we don't, really change anything. So, I mean, we can criticize these people all we want, but if we don't do anything, I mean, how are we any better? Anyways, that was Warburg's remark. Woodrow Wilson and Carter Glass are given credit for the act by most contemporary historians, but all of those concerned, Wilson had least to do with congressional action on the bill. George Creel, Creel, a veteran Washington correspondent, wrote in Harper's Weekly, June 26, 1915, quote, as far as the Democratic Party was concerned, Woodrow Wilson was without influence, save for the patronage he possessed. It was Bryan who whipped Congress into line on the tariff bill, and on the Panama Canal tolls repeal, and on the currency bill. Mr. Bryan later wrote, quote, that is one of the thing that is the one thing in my public career that I regret. My work to secure the enactment of the Federal Reserve Law. End quote, end quote. Yeah, you regret that, but I mean, it's too late now. Sad trombone. Um, on December 25th, on Christmas 1913, The Nation pointed out that, quote, the New York stock market began to rise steadily upon the news of that the Senate was ready to pass the Federal Reserve Act, end quote. This belies the claim that the Federal Reserve Act was a monetary reform bill. The New York Stock Exchange is generally considered an accurate barometer of the true meaning of any financial legislation passed in Washington. Senator Aldrich also decided that he no longer had misgivings about the Federal Reserve Act. How quaint. In a magazine which he owned and which he called The Independent, he wrote in July 1914, quote, before the passage of this act, the New York bankers could only dominate the reserves of New York. Now we are able to dominate the bank reserves of the entire country. End quote. H.W. Laux, Loucks, denounced the Federal Reserve Act in the Great Conspiracy of the House of Morgan. Is this a book or some kind of writing? I guess it's a book. It says the citation says privately printed 1916. Quote, in the Federal Reserve law, they have wrested from the people and secured for themselves the constitutional power to issue money and regulate the value thereof, quote unquote. On page 31, Lukes writes, quote, the House of Morgan is now in supreme control of our industry, commerce, and political affairs. They are in complete control of the policymaking of the Democratic, Republican, and Progressive parties. Well, well, well. I guess it doesn't really matter ultimately which party you vote for, does it? I want to underline this. They are in complete control of the policy making of the Democratic, Republican, and progressive parties. The present extraordinary propaganda for preparedness, quote unquote, is planned more from home coercion than for defense against foreign aggression, end quote, end quote. The signing of the Federal Reserve Act by Woodrow Wilson represented the culmination of years of collusion with his intimate friend Colonel House and Paul Warburg. One of the men of whom House became acquainted in the Wilson administration was Franklin D. Roosevelt, Assistant Secretary of Navy. As soon as he obtained the Democratic nomination for president in 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt made a pilgrimage, quote unquote, to Colonel House's home at Magnolia, Massachusetts. Roosevelt, after the Republican hiatus of the 1920s, filled in the goals of Philip Drew, administrator, which Wilson had not been able to carry out. The late Roosevelt achievements included the late Roosevelt achievements included the enactment of the Social Security program, excess profits tax, and the expansion of the graduated income tax of 90% of earned income. The expansion of the graduated income tax to 90% earned income. Quote, House's biographer, Charles Seymour, wrote, quote, he was wearied by the details of party politics and appointments. Even the share he had taken in constructive domestic legislation, the Federal Reserve Act, tariff revision, and the income tax amendment, did not satisfy him. From the beginning of 1914, he gave more and more of his time to what he regarded as the highest form of politics, and that for which he was particularly suited, international affairs. End quote. In 1938, shortly before he died, House told Charles Seymour, quote, during the last 15 years, I have been close to the center of things, although few people suspect it. Although few people suspect it. Kind of shady, right? Kind of invisible government kind of person. No important foreigner has come to the United States without talking to me. I was close to the movement that nominated Roosevelt. He has given me a free hand in advising him. All the ambassadors have reported to me frequently. End quote. A comparative print of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was as passed by the House of Representatives and amended by the Senate shows the following striking change. the Senate struck out, quote, to suspend the officials of Federal Reserve banks for cause, stated in writing with opportunity of hearing, require the removal of said officials for incompetency, dereliction of duty, fraud, or deceit, such removal to be subject to approval by the President of the United States, end quote. That was struck out of the bill with the Senate. This was changed by the Senate to read, quote, to suspend or remove any officer or director of any Federal Reserve Bank, the cause of such removal to be forthwith communicated in writing by the Federal Reserve Board to the removed officer or director and to said bank, end quote. This completely altered the conditions under which an officer or director might be removed. We no longer know what the conditions for removal are or the cause. Apparently, incompetency, dereliction of duty, fraud, or deceit do not matter to the Federal Reserve Board. Yeah, because you gotta have your shady deals, so you can't be having that in there. Also, the removed officer does not have the opportunity of appeal to the president. In answer to written inquiry, the Assistant Secretary of the Federal Reserve Board replied that only one officer has been removed for cause, quote unquote, in the 36 years, the name and details of this matter being a, quote, private concern, end quote, between the individual, the Reserve Bank concerned, and the Federal Reserve Board. So draconian. The Federal Reserve System began its operations in 1914 with the activity of the Organization Committee appointed by Woodrow Wilson and composed of Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo. What a wackadoo, right? Who was his son-in-law. Wait, what? McAdoo was the son-in-law of Woodrow Wilson? Am I understanding this correctly? Secretary of Agriculture Houston and Comptroller of the Currency John Skelton Williams. It was composed by McAdoo, Houston, and John Skelton Williams. On January 6, 1914, the New York Times reported that the organizing committee of the Federal Reserve System had met in New York and had conferred with Paul Warburg. No surprise there. Quote, Mr. Warburg is regarded as the living authority among local bankers on the problems involved in the new banking and currency system. He agreed with the tentative ideas of the committee, end quote. Yeah, he would be the leading authority because he's the one that freaking wrote it. On January 7th, the next day, 1914, J.P. Morgan met with the organizing committee in New York. He informed them that there should not be more than 7 regional districts in the new system. This committee was to select the locations of the decentralized quote-unquote reserve banks. They were empowered to select from 8 to 12 reserve banks, although JP Morgan had testified he thought that no more than 4 should be selected. Much politicking went into the selection of these sites as the 12 cities thus favored would become enormously important as centers of finance. New York, of course, was a foregone conclusion. Richmond was the next selection as a payoff to Carter Glass and Woodrow Wilson, the 2 Virginians who had been given political credit for the Federal Reserve Act. The other selections of the committee were Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, Dallas, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and San Francisco. It looks like there's only one city in the South. It looks like just Atlanta. Boston, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, St. Louis, Atlanta, Dallas. Oh, Dallas is another one. Atlanta and Dallas in the south, Minneapolis, Kansas City, and San Francisco. All of these cities later developed important financial districts, quote unquote, as the result of this selection. These local battles, however, paled in view of the complete dominance of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in the system. Ferdinand Lundberg pointed out in America's 60 Families that, quote, in practice, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York became the fountainhead of the system of 12 regional banks, for New York was the money market of the nation. The other 11 banks were so many expensive mausoleums erected to salve the local pride and quell the Jacksonian fears of the hinterland. Yeah, I'll say Benjamin Strong, president of the Bankers Trust, J.P. Morgan in parentheses, was selected as the first governor of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. And he's one of the men that was on the at the Jekyll Island conference in 1910, I believe. So, that's not surprising at all. Adept in high finance, Strong for many years manipulated the country's monetary system at the discretion of directors representing the leading New York banks. Under Strong, the reserve system was brought into interlocking relationships with the Bank of England and the Bank of France. Benjamin Strong held his position as governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York until his sudden death in 1928. Well, that seems rather shady. During a congressional investigation of the secret meetings between reserve governors and heads of European central banks, which brought on the Great Depression of 1921 to 1931, 1929 to 1931. Why is there an end quote? Oh, this is still from Lundberg's book. I might try to get this book. Well, not right now, obviously. 60 America's 60 families. Strong had married the daughter of the president of Bankers Trust, which brought him into the line of succession in the dynastic intrigues which play such an important role in the world of high finance. He also had been a member of the original Jekyll Island group. The first member of that, the first member of the First Name Club, which was thus qualified for the highest position in the Federal Reserve System, as the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which dominated the entire system. Paul Warburg, also mentioned in J. Lawrence Laughlin's definitive volume, The Federal Reserve Act, Its Origins and Purposes, quote, Mr. Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company offered in March 1910 a fairly well thought out plan to be known as the United Reserve Bank of the United States. This was published in the New York Times of March 24th, 1910. The group interested in the purposes of the National Monetary Commission met secretly at Jekyll Island for about 2 weeks in December 1910 and concentrated on the preparation of a bill to be presented to Congress by the National Monetary Commission. The men who were present at Jekyll Island were Senator Aldrich, H.P. Davison of J.P. Morgan Company, Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company, Frank Vanderlip of the National City Bank, and Charles D. Norton of the First National Bank. No doubt The ablest banking mind in the group was that of Mr. Warburg, who had had a European banking training. Senator Aldrich had no special training in banking. End quote. A mention of Paul Warburg, written by Harold Kellock, uh, Kelloch, entitled, quote, Warburg the Revolutionist, end quote, appeared in Century Magazine, May 1915. Kellock writes, quote, he imposed his ideas on a nation of 100 million people. Without Mr. Warburg, there would have been no Federal Reserve Act. The banking house of Warburg and Warburg in Hamburg has always been strictly a family business. None but a Warburg has been eligible for it, but all Warburgs have been born into it. In 1895 he married the daughter of the late Solomon Loeb of Kuhn-Loeb Company. He became a member of Kuhn-Loeb Company in 1902. Mr. Warburg's salary from his private business has been approximately $500,000 a year, which is a lot of money back then. I don't know what that would be in today's money, but surely he's rolling in the dough, of course. Mr. Warburg's motives have been purely those of patriotic self-sacrifice. End quote. Yeah, barf. The true purpose of the Federal Reserve Act soon began to disillusion many who had first believed in its claims. W. H. Allen wrote in Moody's Magazine, 1916, quote, the purpose of the Federal Reserve Act was to prevent concentration of money in the New York banks by making it profitable for country bankers to use their funds at home. But the movement of currency shows that the New York banks gained from the interior in every month except banks gained from the interior in every month except December 1915, since the act went into effect. The stabilization rates has taken place in New York alone. In other parts, high rates continue. The act, which was to deprive Wall Street of its funds for speculation, has really given the bulls and the bears such a supply as they never had before. The truth is that far from having clogged the channel to Wall Street, as Mr. Glass so confidently boasted, it actually has widened the old channels and opened up two new ones. The first of these leads directly to Washington and gives Wall Street a string on all the surplus cash in the United States Treasury. Besides, in the power to issue banknote currency, it furnishes an inexhaustible supply of credit money. The second channel leads to the great central banks of Europe, whereby, through the sale of acceptances virtually guaranteed by the U.S. States government, Wall Street is granted immunity from those foreign demands for gold which have precipitated every great crisis in our history. End quote. For many years, there has been considerable mystery about who actually owns the stock of the Federal Reserve banks. Congressman Wright-Patman, which was the person who had the facsimile of the letter to in the front of the book, where Wright-Patman addressed to the author Eustace Mullins. So this is the guy from that the photo of that letter that he keeps the old version of this book as on his desk. Yeah, Congressman Wright-Patman, leading critic of the system, tried to find out who the stockholders were. That's a good question, right? The stock in the original 12 regional Federal Bank Reserve banks was purchased by national banks in those 12 regions because the Federal Reserve Bank of New York was to set the interest rates and direct open market operations, thus controlling the daily supply and price of money throughout the United States. It is the stockholders of that bank who are the real directors of the entire system. For the first time, it can be revealed who those stockholders are. This writer was the original organization. This writer has the original organization certificates of the 12 Federal Reserve banks, giving the ownership of shares by the national banks in each district. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York issued 203,053 shares and is filed with the Comptroller of the Currency May 19th, 1914. The large New York City banks took more than half of the outstanding shares. The Rockefeller Kuhn Loeb controlled National City Bank took the largest number of shares of any bank, 30,000 shares. JP Morgan's First National Bank took 15,000 shares. These two banks merged in 1955, they owned in one block almost one-fourth of the shares in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which controlled the entire system, and thus they could name Paul Volcker, Volcker, or anyone else they choose to be chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Chase National Bank took 6,000 shares. The Marine National Bank of Buffalo, later known as Marine Midland, took 6,000 shares. This bank was owned by the Sholkoff family, Schoellkopf, which controlled Niagara Power Company and other large interests. National Bank of Commerce of New York City took 21,000 shares. The shareholders of these banks, which own the stock of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, are the people who have controlled our political and economic destinies since 1914. They are the Rothschilds of Europe. Lazare Freres, Frere, Eugene Mayer, Kuhn-Loeb Company, Warburg Company, Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, the Rockefeller family, and the J.P. Morgan interests. These interests have merged and consolidated in recent years so that the control is much more concentrated. National Bank of Commerce is now Morgan Guaranty Trust Company. Lehman Brothers has merged with Kuhn Loeb Company. First National Bank has merged with the National City Bank, and in the other 11 Federal Reserve districts, these same shareholders indirectly own or control shares in those banks, with the other shares owned by the leading families in those areas who own or control the principal industries of these regions. Footnote, see charts 5 through 9. Oh, I don't, those charts show up later down the book. Anyways, what a mess. The local quote-unquote families set up regional councils on orders from New York of such groups as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, and other instruments of control devised by their masters. Their finance and control political development. Their finance and control. They finance and control political developments in their area, name candidates, and are seldom successfully opposed in their plans. what can I tell you? This isn't really anything new. It's only worse now, probably. Most likely, definitely. With the setting up of the 12 financial districts, quote unquote, through the Federal Reserve Banks, the traditional division of the United States into 48 states was overthrown, and we entered the era of regionalism, quote unquote, or 12 regions which had no relation to the traditional state boundaries. These developments following the passing of the Federal Reserve Act prove every one of the allegations Thomas Jefferson had made against a central bank in 1791, that the subscribers to the Federal Reserve Bank stock had formed a corporation whose stock could be and was held by aliens of other countries, obviously, that this stock would be transmitted to a certain line of successors, that it would be placed beyond forfeiture and escheat, escheat, that they would receive a monopoly of banking, which was against the laws of monopoly, and they now had and that they now had the power to make laws paramount to the laws of the states. No state legislator can countermand, countermand any of the laws laid down by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors for the benefit of their private stockholders. This board issues laws as to what the interest rate shall be, what the quantity of money shall be, and what the price of money shall be. All of these powers abrogate the powers of the state legislators and their responsibility to the citizens of those states. The New York Times stated that the Federal Reserve Banks would be ready for business on August 1st, 1914, but they actually began operations in November 16th, 1914. At that time, their total assets were listed at $143 million from the sale of shares in the Federal Reserve Banks to stockholders of the national banks which subscribed to it. The actual part of this $143 million, which was paid in for these shares, remains shrouded in mystery. Some historians believe that the shareholders only paid about half of the amount in cash. Others believed that they paid in no cash at all, but merely sent in checks which they drew on the national banks which they owned. This seems most likely that from the very outset, the Federal Reserve operations were, quote, paper issued against paper, end quote. The bookkeeping entries comprised the only values which changed hands. The men whom President Woodrow Wilson chose to make up the first Federal Reserve Board of Governors were men drawn from the banking group. He had been nominated for the presidency by the Democratic Party, which had claims to represent the common man, quote unquote, against the vested interests, quote unquote. According to Wilson himself, he was allowed to choose only one man for the Federal Reserve Board. The others were chosen by the New York bankers. Wilson's choice was Thomas D. Jones, a trustee of Princeton and director of International Harvester and other corporations. The other members were Adolph C. Miller, economist from Rockefeller's University of Chicago and Morgan's Harvard University, and also serving as Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Charles S. Hamlin, who had served previously as an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for 8 years, F. A. Delano, a Roosevelt relative, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, um, and railroad operator who took over a number of railroads for Kuhn Loeb and Company. W.P.G. Harding, president of the First National Bank of Atlanta, and Paul Warburg of Kuhn Loeb Company, according to the intimate papers of Colonel House. Warburg was appointed because, quote, the president accepted House's suggestion of Paul Warburg of New York because of his interest and experience in currency problems under both Republican and Democratic administrations, end quote. Yeah, right. He's the one that fucking wrote the thing, so this is him getting the power, right? Like Warburg, Delano had also been born outside the continental limits of the United States, although he was an American citizen. Delano's father, Warren Delano, according to Dr. Josephson and other authorities, was active in Hong Kong in the Chinese opium trade, and Frederick Delano was born in Hong Kong, 1863. In The Money Power of Europe, and that's also another book I'd probably want to get. Paul Emden, Emden, writes that, quote, the Warburgs reached their outstanding eminence during the last 20 years of the past century. Simultaneously with the growth of Kuhn Loeb Company in New York, with whom they stood in a personal union and family relationship, Paul Warburg, with magnificent success, carried through in 1913 the reorganization of the American banking system, at which he had with with Senator Aldrich been working since 1911, and thus most thoroughly consolidated the currency and finances of the United States, end quote. The New York Times footnote. New York Times, April 30th, 1914, reported that the 12 districts had subscriptions reported that 12 districts had subscriptions of 74,740,800 and that the subscribing banks would pay one half of this sum in 6 months. End of footnote. The New York Times had noted on May 6th, 1914, that Paul Warburg had retired, quote unquote, from Kuhn Loeb Company in order to serve on the Federal Reserve Board, although he had not resigned his directorships of American Surety Company, Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, National Railways of Mexico, Wells Fargo, or Westinghouse Electric Company, but would continue to serve on these boards of directors. Who's Who listed him as holding these directorships, and in addition, American IG Chemical Company, branch of IG Farben, Agfa Ansco Corporation, Westinghouse Acceptance Company, Warburg Company of Amsterdam, chairman of the board of International Acceptance Bank, and numerous other banks, railways, and corporations. Quote, Kuhn Loeb and Company with Warburg have 4 votes or the majority of the Federal Reserve Board, end quote. Despite his retirement from Kuhn Loeb Company in May of 1914 to serve on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, Warburg was asked to appear before a Senate subcommittee in June of 1914 and answer some questions about his behind-the-scenes role in getting the Federal Reserve Act through Congress. This might have meant some questions about the secret conference in Jekyll Island, and Warburg refused to appear. Yeah, figures. On July 7th, 1914, he wrote a letter to G.M. Hitchcock, chairman of the Senate um, Banking and Currency Committee, stating that it might impair his usefulness on the board if he were required to answer any questions, and that he would therefore withdraw his name. Yeah, asshole. However, Woodrow Wilson refused to withdraw his name. It seemed that Warburg was prepared to bluff the Senate committee into confirming him without any questions asked. The nerve. On July 10th, 1914, the New York Times defended Warburg on the editorial page and denounced the senatorial inquisition, quote unquote. That's so freaking dumb. Since Warburg had not yet been asked any questions, the term inquisition, quote unquote, seemed remarkably inappropriate. Yeah, no shit. Nor was there any real danger to that the senators were preparing to use instruments of torture on Mr. Warburg. The imbroglio, IMBROGLIO, was resolved when the Senate committee, in abject surrender, agreed that Mr. Warburg would be given a list of questions in advance of his appearance so that he could go over them, and that he could be excused from answering any questions that might tend to impair his service on the board of governors. What weak sauce. Freaking useless freaking politicians. So dumb. The Nation reported on July 23rd, 1914 that, quote, Mr. Warburg finally had a conference with Senator O'Gorman and agreed to meet the members of the Senate subcommittee informally with a view to coming to an understanding and giving them any reasonable information they might desire. The opinion in Washington is that Mr. Warburg's confirmation is assured. End quote. It's like he doesn't even have to answer questions. They send him a list of questions that he may or may not answer, and then he's informally going to visit them like on his terms, and then they just and it's assured that he's going to get the confirmation. I mean, like, what more do you need? Like, what more do you need? The Nation was correct. Mr. Warburg was confirmed. Yeah, see, the way having been smoothed by his fixer, quote unquote, Senator O'Gorman of New York, more familiarly known as, quote, the senator from Wall Street, quote unquote, Senator Robert L. Owen had previously charged that Warburg was the American representative of the Rothschilds family, but questioning him about this would indeed have smacked of the medieval Inquisition, quote unquote, and his family and his fellow senators were too civilized to indulge in such barbarity. What a sack of shit. Yeah, there's a footnote here. Warburg was confirmed August 8th, 1914, 38-11. Jeez. And principally opposed by Senator Bristow, Bristow, of Kansas. At least somebody has something to them, who was denounced by the New York Times as a, quote, radical Republican, end quote. What bunch of pansies. Oh, he's a radical Republican. And whose excellent library of rare books on banking were acquired by the present writer in 1983 for research on this work. Hmm, interesting. End of footnote. During the Senate hearings on Paul Warburg before the Senate Banking and Currency Committee, August 1st, 1914, Senator Bristow asked, quote, how many of these partners of Kuhn Loeb Company and are American citizens, end quote. Warburg, quote, they are all American citizens except Mr. Kahn. He is a British subject, end quote. Bristow, quote, he was at one time a candidate for parliament, was he not? End quote. Warburg, quote, there was talk about it. It had been suggested and he had it in his mind. End quote. Paul Warburg also stated to the committee, quote, I went to England where I stayed for 2 years, first in the banking and discount firm of Samuel Montague and Company. After that, I went to France where I stayed in a French bank. End quote. Chairman, quote, what French bank was that? End quote. Warburg, quote, it is the Russian Bank for Foreign Trade, which had an agency in Paris. End quote. Russian bank, you say? Bristow, quote, I understand you to say that you were a Republican, but when Mr. Theodore Roosevelt came around, you then became a sympathizer with Mr. Wilson and supported him? End quote. Warburg, quote, yes, quote, end quote. Bristow, quote, while your brother, Felix Warburg, was supporting Taft, end quote. Warburg, quote, yes, end quote. These three partners of Kuhn Loeb Company were supporting three different candidates for the President of the United States. Paul Warburg was supporting Wilson, Felix Warburg was supporting Taft, and Otto Kahn was supporting Theodore Roosevelt. Paul Warburg explained his curious situation by telling the committee that they had no influence over each other's political beliefs. Quote, as finance and politics don't mix, end quote. They absolutely do mix. What a load of horseshit, sir. Questions about Warburg's appointment vanished in a hue and cry with Wilson's sole appointment to the Board of Governors. Thomas B. Jones. Reporters had discovered that Jones, at the time of his appointment, was under indictment by the Attorney General of the United States. Wilson leaped to the defense of his choice, telling reporters that, quote, the majority of men connected with what we have come to call big business, quote unquote, are honest, incorruptible, and patriotic, end quote. Well, a sack of horseshit on that one. Despite Wilson's protestations, the Senate Banking and Currency Committee scheduled hearings on the fitness of Thomas D. Jones to be a member of the Board of Governors. Wilson then wrote a letter to Senator Robert L. Owen, chairman of that committee, quote, White House, June 18, 1914. Dear Senator Owen, Mr. Jones has always stood for the rights of the people against the rights of privilege. His connection with the Harvester Company was a public service, not a private interest. He is the one man of the whole number who was, in a peculiar sense, my personal choice. And sincerely, Woodrow Wilson, end quote. Woodrow Wilson said, quote, there is no reason to believe that the unfavorable report represents the attitude of the Senate itself, end quote. After several weeks, Thomas D. Jones withdrew his name, and the country had to do without his services. Sheesh. The one guy he gets to point doesn't even make it. How retarded is that? The other members of the first Board of Governors were Secretary of the Treasury William McAdoo, I'm going to call this guy William Wackadoo. Wilson's son-in-law. How's that not nepotism? And the president of Hudson-Manhattan Railroad, a Kuhn-Loeb company controlled enterprise, and comptroller of the currency, John Skelton Williams. When the Federal Reserve banks were opened for business on November 16th, 1914, Paul Warburg said, quote, "This date may be considered as the 4th of July in the economic history of the United States." End quote. And that is the end of chapter chapter 3, excuse me. And my throat is getting really itchy, and we're gonna have to end it here. So this has gone way longer than I thought it would. But there's some riveting stuff in here. I mean, I guess for nerds, but not for nerds. It's for everybody. This is partly a large part of how we're in the situation we are in today, because the Federal Reserve uh, system is still very much intact and very much controlling a lot of shit. Maybe not everything, but a lot. So I mean, that's gonna be it for this part. Sad trombone.